It's 4:30 p.m. on December 1st, 1934, and Sergei Kirov, first secretary of the Central Committee, hurries to his office in Smolny Institute, the Bolshevik headquarters in Leningrad. He has an important meeting ahead of him, in which he will convey the important decision of the Central Committee of the Communist Party to abolish rationing. The day before in Moscow, he had been given this task by Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin. On his way to the office, however, he is crossed by Leonid Nikolaev, an expelled party member and a failed junior functionary. He puts a gun to the back of his head and fires. Kirov dies instantly. Nikolaev was apparently a mentally unstable party member who wanted to kill the head of the party that had expelled him. But he also wanted revenge because his wife was alleged to be Kirov's mistress. Soviet leader Stalin kept these reasons to himself. He immediately uses Kirov's murder for another purpose, to get rid of his party rivals. 2 days after Kirov's death, he orders the secret police to gather evidence to prove that the assassination was the result of a secret party plot. Half a week later, the first arrests begin. Stalin unleashes the Great Purge. In the next 4 years, he arrests over 1.5 million supposed political opponents from the Communist Party, the intelligentsia, ethnic minorities, and the peasantry. Over 700,000 of them are executed. Stalin ruled the empire for nearly 31 years and became one of the most ruthless leaders of the 20th century. Tens of millions of people died during his reign in execution camps, gulags, during the Civil War and the famine. Ioseb Vissarionovich Zayugashvili was born into great poverty in the Georgian town of Gori. His father, Bessarion, was nicknamed Besa because of his cruel nature, which Joseph took after him. He was a cobbler but drank away most of his earnings. His mother, Ekaterin, had no education and supported the family by taking on any menial job available. Joseph had 2 older siblings, but they died in infancy. Only Joseph, nicknamed Soso, survived. His father beat his mother daily, and little Soso tried to defend her, once even stabbing his father with a knife. His mother clung to her faith and had one wish, for Soso to become a priest. She was illiterate and spoke only Georgian at home. But she persuaded the local priest in Gori to teach Joseph to speak and write Russian. The requirements for admission to the theological school in Gori was thus fulfilled, and Soso became a student. He was intelligent and successfully completed his studies. He advanced to the theological seminary in Tbilisi. Ironically, he later became an atheist. He complained about bullying by the priests and the Jesuit methods. He embraced the complete opposite spiritual movement, Marxism. After 4 years of his studies, he was expelled from the seminary for failing exams, but his education was enough for him to make a living as a teacher. He studied mathematics for a while, but his fascination with Marxism and revolution won. Joseph started organizing labor strikes in Tbilisi factories. Due to arrests and being exiled, he changed his identity and was given a new nickname, Koba, which was the name of a Georgian folk hero. And when the Social Democratic Party split into the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks in 1903, he joined the more extreme Bolsheviks. He became a professional revolutionary. In 1904, he organized a huge strike of approximately 40,000 workers in Baku. He was noticed by the head of the Bolsheviks, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, who at that time went by the pseudonym Lenin. He made Joseph one of the Bolshevik leaders. He appreciated his Marxist convictions and his financial contribution to the Bolshevik Party. In fact, Joseph organized a huge raid on Central Bank in Tbilisi. The robbers escaped with an astronomical 241,000 rubles. But the Bolsheviks did not see this as theft. In line with the ideology of Marxism, they saw it as expropriation. In 1906, Jugashvili married Ekaterina Svanidze in a church. Within a year, their son Yakov was born. The following year, his wife died of typhus. Joseph was devastated but did not care for his son. He devoted himself to the revolution. He changed his name to Stalin, the Man of Steel. Stal means steel in Russian. He was captured and imprisoned several times, repeatedly exiled to Siberia by the Tsarist courts. But most of the time he escaped from there. The same was true in 1917. The overthrow of the Tsar, and then the provisional government in the October Revolution, marked a career breakthrough for Stalin when the Bolsheviks led by Lenin finally seized power. First, he became People's Commissar for Nationalities, and for 3 more years, civil war raged in Russia. When the Bolsheviks won in 1920 and the Soviet Union was formed 2 years later, Stalin was one of the 3 most important men running the country. In addition to him, he was joined by his fellow party members Zinoviev and Kamenev. Lenin suffered a stroke that year and gradually withdrew from political life. But Leon Trotsky was also a threat. He was a man close to Lenin, whom Stalin hated and later got rid of as ruthlessly as he had done to Zinoviev and Kamenev. On April 3, 1922, Stalin was appointed General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. It was just supposed to be a formality, because Lenin remained the leader of the party and the government. However, Stalin did not stop there, and Lenin's warnings were in vain. In a letter to the 13th Congress of the Russian Communist Party, he proposed Stalin's removal as General Secretary because of his rudeness, lack of loyalty, and abuse of power. However, Lenin dies before the Congress takes place, and Stalin consolidated his position even more. Before that, Stalin started a new family. His second wife, Nadezhda Alliluyeva, bore him a son, Vasily, in 1921. Together they also adopted Artyom Sergeyev, the son of Stalin's friend, and Yakov, Stalin's son from his first marriage. In 1926 they had a daughter, Svetlana, Stalin's favorite child. Stalin's first great act was establishing collectivization in the late 1920s. Russia had always been an agrarian country, and the majority of its people made a living by farming. For centuries, people served the big landlords. Serfdom was abolished in Russia in 1861. People were thus free to dispose of their land for only a few decades. Suddenly, Stalin came along to take their land. The peasants weren't going to let that happen. They began to rebel. He called them by the derogatory term kulaks, and society was supposed to view them as exploiters. Then the surveillance began. The police began to prosecute anyone who tried to hide grain supplies. 300,000 people were executed. The same number of people were sent to the gulag, and 2 million peasants were deported to Siberia. It all culminated during the famine of the early 1930s. Stalin implemented a severe levy on grain, and everything the peasants grew was seized. In Ukraine, 5 million people starved to death between 1932 and 1933. Across the Soviet Union, the death toll was as high as 8 million. Stalin punished the peasants for their resistance in a brutal way. The whole policy was nothing more than cold-blooded genocide. Industrialization was carried out in order to reduce the economy's lag behind the developed capitalist states. Stalin approved the 5-year plan. It began in 1928, and by 1933, 1,500 factories were to be built. Stalin bought technology from the West with money made from the sale of grain, precious metals, and oil. Stalin did not admit criticism. He eliminated it. He was feared by his people. He didn't show a hint of emotion when killing his closest colleagues and friends. As we have already said, the death of Sergei Kirov unleashed the events like the Great Terror or the Great Purge. Stalin declared war on his own people. He accused them of preparing a series of assassinations against himself and members of the government. He had Zinoviev and Kamenev arrested. Along with the greatest heroes of the revolution, no one knew who could be the next victim. The sense of terror paralyzed everyone in the country. Stalin played a game with his victims that resulted in a series of monstrous trials that went down in history as the Moscow trials. There were 3 in total and led to the execution of many of the defendants. Accusations turned into forced confessions of treason and absurd crimes they were not guilty of. Nearly 100 leading politicians were given the death penalty. Even those who helped organize the purges with Stalin were executed. Ordinary people also feared Stalin since he signed a decree which allowed alleged enemies of the state to be arrested and sentenced to death without trial. He created the so-called Troika, which consisted of the head of the secret police, the secretary of the Communist Party, and the regional prosecutor. When the Troika agreed, there was no appeal. The repression was aimed at kulaks, former enemies from the Civil War, former Tsarist officials, church leaders, and alleged spies. The atmosphere of fear that accompanied these people's court hearings led to people denouncing each other and ending up in prisons or being executed, even for minor incidents. The 70,000 people executed in 1937 and 1938 were mostly innocent. Stalin's reign was then overshadowed to some extent by that of another dictator, Adolf Hitler. The victory of the Soviet Union in the Second World War gives the impression that Stalin was an opponent of Hitler. But the opposite is true. Throughout the first 2 years of the war, until Hitler's attack on the Soviet Union, the two countries worked together. The Mutual Non-Aggression Pact, known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which was named after the ministers of foreign affairs of both countries, included a secret amendment, in which they divided up the territory of Poland. Stalin then additionally seized the Baltic states. During the war, Hitler disappoints Stalin when he attacks the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941. The attack was the beginning of a premeditated war against the Slavic population, with the aim of destroying the Bolshevik regime and expanding Germany. Stalin purged the military command. Several high-ranking figures were demoted or reassigned, and others were arrested and executed. Therefore, he issued Order No. 227. Hundreds of thousands of conscripts went to the front, and Soviet casualties were enormous. Gradually, however, the Red Army began to push the Germans out of their territory, and in May 1945 they reached Berlin victoriously. Stalin thus became the winner of the war, who could afford to create a network of communist satellites directly controlled by Moscow. Czechoslovakia and East Germany were the westernmost points. After the war, Stalin continued to stay in power. Some things didn't work out for him, like the blockade of West Berlin or annexing the newly formed State of Israel to the Soviet bloc. But his country was widely recognized as a great power, and he was the undisputed ruler. In mid-February 1953, Stalin went to his cottage in Kuntsevo near Moscow. There is conflicting information about the course of subsequent events. All that is certain is that Stalin spent the night of March 1st, 1953, eating and drinking until the early morning. When no sounds were heard the next day, members of the Protectorate entered the room. Stalin was laying unconscious on the floor. Doctors could no longer help him, and 4 days later, on March 5th, 1953, Stalin died. The Soviet Union had thus lost a ruler who was an idol to some and one of the most brutal rulers in history to others. Nowadays, at least from the Western European point of view, the second mentioned is true.